In the mid-14th century, the region of Italy was a patchwork of bustling city-states, rural villages, and wealthy trading ports. Cities like Florence, Milan, Venice, and Genoa were thriving centers of commerce and culture. Italian merchants sailed to far-off lands, returning with spices, silks, and plenty of stories. But they unwittingly also carried a hidden menace. The population had swelled, and in many places people lived in crowded conditions. Few could have imagined that this prosperity would soon give way to a crisis of unimaginable proportion. Society was about to face a trial that would test the resilience of every institution and every individual. Before the calamity struck, life went on with its usual rhythm. Markets bustled, churches rang their bells, and the scholars in the universities debated. But by 1346, troubling rumors began to trickle into Italy from distant lands. Tales arrived of a mysterious and deadly illness ravaging cities in the east. In places like Constantinople and beyond, the situation was dire. Such accounts seemed remote and even fantastical to many Italians. After all, plagues, famines, they were not unknown. But nothing could prepare them for the scale of what was to come. The interconnectedness of Italy, the very trade networks that brought them wealth, would also bring the deadly plague right to their doorstep. And in this tense calm before the storm, no prediction of the astrologer or a priest's sermon could foresaw what would happen within that year. Everyday life would be utterly transformed by death on an almost unimaginable scale. Hello and welcome to the channel. Here we are again, going back, looking at the plague, specifically today, the situation in the region of Italy and its patchwork of kingdoms in the 14th century. If you've not seen my other plague videos, I'm sure they'll come up on the suggested videos, or you can look for them in the medieval playlist. Now, before we do go on, this video is kindly ad-free due to the very generous contributions of those on the Patreon and the YouTube memberships, and also those who checked out the merch store. You have my thanks. Those who have not yet clicked the subscribe button, I invite you to do so, and leave a comment as to where you're listening from. Perhaps your country has some plague history. Now, without further ado, and all of the customary introductions out of the way, let's get to the topic for the day. And we can begin as the plague arrives in the year 1347. And we begin in the autumn of that very year, where ominous signs of the coming catastrophe reached the shores of Italy. According to one widely told account, the plague's journey to Europe began during a siege in the distant Black Sea port of Kaffa. It was there that the Mongol armies besieging the Genoese trading colony were said to have catapulted the corpses of plague victims over the walls, a very gruesome early form of biological warfare. Genoese merchants fled by ship, perhaps carrying the infection with them. Whether or not the siege story is entirely true, what is certain is that Italian ships from the Crimea brought the infection westward. In October of 1347, the first undeniable reports of a strange and lethal illness on Italian soil became not just a myth, but a reality, a far-off story now manifesting itself right before their very eyes. Genoese trading ships returning from the Black Sea arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina. On board, many sailors were already dead, or pretty close to it, their bodies covered in ominous black swellings. The people of Messina were horrified by the sight. One can hardly blame them. It's not normal to have those buboes all over your body. So almost immediately, the sickness spread like wildfire throughout the city. Panic set in as residents realized that this was no ordinary sickness. It killed with frightening speed, often within mere days of showing symptoms. Messina's authorities hastily ordered these death ships out of the harbor, hoping to expel the plague along with the sailors, go somewhere else, be someone else's problem. But it was all too late. The plague had taken root in Sicily, and from there it began its steady march across the Italian peninsula. By the end of 1347, the contagion had leapt from port to port. Ships carried it to Genoa and Venice, two of Italy's greatest maritime republics. In fact, legend has it that in Genoa, desperate officials tried to turn away the plague-infested ships, even threatening to sink them if they came any closer. But still, the disease found its way into the city. In Venice, that winter, eerie rumors of sudden death began circulating. Because trade ships and caravans were constantly moving, no corner of Italy remained isolated for long. In 1348, the plague, later called the Black Death in our more modern vernacular, had firmly established itself in Italy's south, and so it was poised from there to spread inland. The disease itself was terrifying to behold. It began with a fever, painful swellings in the groin or armpits, and dark blotches on the skin. Contemporary observers in Italy described how victims would develop egg-sized lumps, buboes, in the armpits or groin, which turned a livid black. Many sufferers coughed blood, a sign that the infection had reached the lungs. Now, once these symptoms had appeared, you were pretty much done for. Death was only a matter of days away, sometimes mere hours, and most people were hoping for the latter, as those matter of days were not going to be very pleasant. If your fate was sealed, you may as well get it over with quickly. The sickness seemed almost supernatural in its lethal efficiency. Italian chroniclers struggled to find the words to capture its horror, often simply calling it la mortalità, the mortality, or pestilenza, the pestilence. But either way, there was no cure. Physicians were baffled. Their ancient textbooks were useless against a malady that killed so swiftly and in such grotesque fashion. What was there to do? By the spring of 1348, the plague was roaring through the heart of Italy. No city, no village, no valley in the Apennines was spared for long. Florence, a city of perhaps 100,000, was struck in March 1348, and within weeks, thousands were dead. A Florentine writer who we'll be hearing quite a bit from, Giovanni Boccaccio, witnessed the devastation firsthand in his city. He wrote of how people responded in shockingly different ways. Some shut themselves up in their homes, avoiding all human contact. Doesn't sound too bad. Others engaged in wild revelry, drinking and feasting, as if to somehow drown out the terror. He described how, quote, brother abandoned brother. Fathers and mothers refused to tend to their children as if they were not their own. Fear snuffed out the natural bonds of love and kinship. When every neighbor might carry a deadly contagion, the instinct of self-preservation overwhelmed even the most base familial duty. And as Boccaccio chillingly noted, the contagion was so potent that even touching the clothes or belongings of the sick could doom the healthy. People learned to shrink away from any contact at all. Scenes of daily life, well, they all turned quite nightmarish. In city after city, the routine of funerals and mourning rituals broke down completely. There were simply too many bodies to bury. In Florence, bodies were left in front of churches or piled in the streets. The overwhelmed grave diggers could not keep up. The city's priests, grave diggers, and carpenters who made coffins were among the first victims. They all caught the illness from the dead and dying they tried to perform the last rites for, or tried to bury. And soon there was no one to give proper burial to the growing stacks of corpses. Boccaccio recounts how with churchyards full, trenches were dug, and the dead were laid in, quote, like goods in a ship's hold, one on top of the other, hastily covered with earth. The normal dignity of death and a funeral was replaced by silence and mass graves. Bells that tolled, once for individual funerals, now began to ring out incessantly, or sometimes not at all, because the person whose job it was to ring the bell had died of the plague. Siena, Florence's Tuscan neighbor, suffered a similar fate. A Sienese man named Agnolo di Tura recorded his heartbreaking personal experience. Quote, "The mortality in Siena began in May. It was a cruel and horrible thing. I buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so did many others likewise." Pretty simple words, but quite anguished, that's for sure. So many died so fast that survivors often had to bury their own family members without any help. Agnolo noted that in Siena all believed that it was the end of the world. Indeed, normal life had certainly ceased, become a distant memory. The city's grand plans, including the construction of an enormous new cathedral nave, came to an abrupt halt. Those half-built walls in Siena remain today as a stark reminder of a dream cut short. Across Italy, the social order teetered upon collapse. People who had relied on community and the church for support now found both of them collapsing. In some areas, entire villages were emptied of life. Fields went untended, crops unharvested. Farm animals wandered unattended since their keepers had perished. In the cities, shops and workshops closed as craftsmen died and apprentices fled. Contemporary chronicles across Italy offer staggering figures. One claimed that Venice lost over half of its 100,000 inhabitants. Another wrote that in the Sicilian city of Catania, only 1 in 3 people survived. Modern estimates suggest that many communities suffered mortalities of around 50% or more. Numbers like that, it defies comprehension. A society cannot simply lose half of its people overnight without spiraling into complete shock, even in our modern day. But the wheels of commerce, they nearly ground to a halt too. Chroniclers in various cities reported it was as if a dark cloud had descended over their land, obscuring the usual chatter of markets, the laughter of children, replaced with an awful stillness, punctuated only by the disturbing wails of grief. Yet in the chaos, there were those who tried to maintain a semblance of order and compassion. Neighbors, when brave enough, became caretakers by necessity. Some priests and nuns, driven by faith or duty, continued to tend to the sick, and the dying, despite the mortal danger to themselves. And many paid with their lives. The death toll among the clergy was, of course, extraordinarily high. In monasteries and convents from Lombardy to Umbria, whole communities of monks and nuns were wiped out, having offered final prayers and comfort to plague victims. These sacrifices often went unnoticed in the larger tide of the calamity, but they were part of how Italy managed to endure, through individual acts of courage and charity that flickered like candles in that darkness. But don't think that the Italian city-states succumbed without a fight. As the plague swept through, city governments, often composed of merchant elites, scrambled to respond in any way that they could. With no understanding of bacteria or contagion, at least in the modern sense, officials relied on observation, instinct, and the few tools at their disposal. These early public health measures varied from city to city, revealing how different communities tried to survive the onslaught. One of the most remarkable examples comes from the town of Pistoia in Tuscany. In May 1348, even as people were dying in the streets, the city's leaders convened to issue an emergency set of health ordinances. The ordinances read like a desperate but reasoned attempt to halt the spread. Pistoia had banned all travel to and from certain neighboring cities known to be plague-stricken. No citizen of Pistoia was allowed to go to Pisa or Lucca, and no one from these places could enter Pistoia under threat of heavy fines. The authorities also prohibited the import of used clothing or linens, suspecting that fabric might carry the sickness. Now this is interesting because it shows that some Italians intuitively grasped that disease could cling to objects, a rudimentary understanding of contagion. Pistoia's laws even addressed burial practices. They forbade bringing any corpse into the city from outside, and regulated funeral gatherings to prevent crowds. Public grief was curtailed. Loud mourning and feasts of condolence were discouraged or outright banned, partly to avoid drawing people together in large numbers, and partly to maintain public order, preventing panic. Venice, a sprawling port city interlaced with canals, faced the plague early due to its extensive trade links. The Venetian Republic reacted decisively too. In 1348, the Venetian Great Council took the unprecedented step of appointing 3 guardians of public health to coordinate the city's response to the plague. These officials, known as Savi, or wise men, had the authority to impose measures to protect the public. Venice had learned of Pistoia and other cities' experiments and built upon them. And so, the city began isolating arriving ships suspected of carrying plague. Captains were ordered to keep their crews on board if illness was present, effectively a quarantine at port. Over the coming months, this practice became more symptomatic, and while the term quarantine meant 40 days, actually, carol in the French too, it was not formalized until a bit later. The essential concept was born here. The idea that a ship or people should be isolated for a period before they could mix with the population was a radical and innovative step at the time. It reflected an emerging realization among Italians that the plague, though mysterious, traveled with people and goods. And as for Milan in the north, well, they became famous for a very different approach, one both ruthless and, according to some accounts, quite effective. Milan was ruled by the Visconti family, and in 1348 It was Lord Lucino Visconti. According to one chronicler, when the plague appeared in Milan, Visconti ordered that the houses where it was found would be immediately sealed up. In some tellings, this meant bricking up entire families inside their homes, and that includes the healthy with the sick, ensuring the disease did not spread further. It was a grim measure that condemned the sealed victims to death, but many believed that it was for the greater good, saving the city from the worst of the pestilence. And indeed, Milan seemed to suffer far fewer casualties than other northern cities that year. While precise numbers are lost to time, later generations remember that Milan did not experience the same overwhelming mortality in 1348 as places like Florence or Venice did. Later historians have debated whether Milan was truly spared or simply delaying the inevitable, since major outbreaks did strike there in the years following. But at least in the collective memory, Milan's strict containment strategy in 1348 stood out as quite unique. It was a draconian response, sure, but it shows the length to which authorities were willing to go when faced with this existential threat. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see that Milan's policy was an early form of extreme quarantine, a brutal acknowledgement that isolating the sick was the key to protecting the healthy. In Florence, the Republican government also took actions, though with limited success against such a fast-moving scourge. There are records that Florence attempted to clean the city, for instance by removing waste and even applying aromatic smoke in the streets to purify the bad air, which many thought carried the plague. At one point, officials talked of cutting off access to the city for outsiders, but by the time the measures were debated, the plague was already raging inside the city walls. Too little, too late. The Florentine government did organize the collection of bodies by crews of people. Sometimes convicts were pressed into this ghastly service, and arranged mass graves outside the city when church cemeteries overflowed. These steps may not have reduced the death toll significantly, but they did help Florence cope and ultimately survive by preventing the total breakdown of civic order. Even in catastrophe, the governing institutions did not completely collapse. Florentines continued to hold council meetings, when enough councillors were alive and willing to attend, that is, and maintained guard patrols, to deter looting. The continuity of some governance, however strained, meant that when the plague finally passed, there was a framework of authority still there, waiting to rebuild the city. Even in the course of wars in Italy was abruptly altered by the plague. In early 1348, while the pestilence spread, a conflict raged in the south. King Louis of Hungary invaded the kingdom of Naples, seeking revenge for the murder of his brother. Louis's forces captured Naples, but then the plague struck the crowded city and the occupying army. The soldiers began dying en masse, far more falling to sickness than to the sword, much more effective. In the face of this invisible enemy, King Louis hastily withdrew his army and returned home. Queen Joanna of Naples, who had been on the brink of losing her crown, was suddenly spared by the same plague that terrorized her subjects. A kind of dark irony that the Black Death in this case halted a war in a way diplomacy or battle could not. Across Italy, other feuds and conflicts similarly paused, as both victors and vanquished found themselves equally threatened by disease. Smaller towns and other cities implemented their own ad hoc measures. In some places, town gates were shut to outsiders. Trade was halted, and markets were closed to avoid gatherings. City officials often fled or died, but those who remained tried to enforce rules about movement and cleanliness. For example, in the city of Lucca, we know that ordinances similar to Pistoia's were enacted, limiting entrance of travelers and goods from infected areas. The attempts at quarantine were, admittedly, imperfect, and often came too late, but they were critical early experiments in public health. Over the next decades, Italian cities would refine these methods, establishing more permanent health boards and quarantine stations, direct legacies of the crisis of 1348. Indeed, Italy's painful experience with the Black Death taught lessons that eventually helped the peninsula to better survive later plagues, and there was plenty of them. Well, in a devoutly religious age, it's not much of a surprise that many in Italy saw the Black Death as a divine punishment, or just a test of faith. When the plague first struck, people flocked to the churches, praying desperately for deliverance. Special masses were said and processions wound through the city streets, with barefoot penitents singing hymns and carrying relics of saints in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. However, as the death toll began to soar, something happened that was unprecedented. The usual religious rituals seemed to be completely powerless to stop the calamity. In fact, gathering crowds for processions may have inadvertently hastened the spread of the disease. Some church leaders began to discourage large gatherings for prayer, a striking reversal of the instinct to meet crisis with communal faith. One extraordinary religious movement arose directly from the anguish of the plague years, that being the flagellants. Bands of flagellant penitents appeared in northern Italy by late 1348, though the movement had started north of the Alps and then spread. Groups of men, and sometimes women, traveling from town to town, whipping themselves while begging for God's forgiveness of humanity's sins. These movements were finally condemned by the Pope as ineffectual, but to the people of the time, every other religious response was equally as useless. The perceived failure of traditional prayers led ordinary folks to try more extreme measures. The onlookers in cities like Padua or Modena saw these flagellants as a shockingly dramatic sight. Hundreds of penitents, half naked, scourging their own flesh until blood ran, all to atone for the collective guilt of the people. At first, some communities welcomed them, hoping that their extreme piety would indeed call off God's anger. But as time went on, the official church hierarchy, including the Pope, by the way, who was then not in Rome but actually in Avignon, began to grow weary of the flagellants. Pope Clement VI condemned their rituals as heretical and feared that their gatherings only spread more disease and more social unrest. And so by 1349, local authorities in Italy were cracking down on the flagellants. The flagellant movement disappeared as quickly as it had arisen, but it certainly left a mark on popular imagination, a sign of how desperate and fearful the people had really become. All the while, the faithful sought their own old-fashioned forms of heavenly help. Italians lit candles before images of the Virgin Mary and prayed novenas, pleading for divine intervention. Many invoked special patron saints against the plague. One such figure was Saint Sebastian, traditionally entreated as a protector against epidemics. In churches, people gazed at depictions of Sebastian pierced by arrows, believing that just as he survived their wounds, they might survive theirs. In the aftermath of the plague, votive churches and altars dedicated to Sebastian and other plague saints sprang up in many cities, a lasting spiritual response to the trauma. Artists also gave expression to the collective ordeal. In Pisa, shortly after the plague years, painters created a vivid mural known as the Triumph of Death, showing an allegorical figure of death sweeping down on a crowd of unsuspecting nobles. Such artwork, born from the fresh trauma of 1348, served as both a memorial and a warning. Yet for all these devotions and artistic expressions of hope, a darker side of fear emerged as well. And fear bred suspicion. Across Europe during the Black Death, minority communities were often scapegoated, accused of poisoning wells or causing the plague through malevolent sorcery. In parts of Germany and France, this led to horrific pogroms and massacres of minorities in 1348 to 49. Italy, too, was not entirely immune to these rumors. Some people in northern Italian cities whispered that Jews or lepers might be spreading the sickness. However, the situation in Italy remained comparatively less violent toward Jews, at least compared to other regions. And one of the reasons was the intervention of Pope Clement VI, who in the summer of 1348 issued public statements condemning the persecutions. He pointed out that the plague was afflicting everybody, so logically a small minority could not be the cause. Many Italian city officials heeded this reasoning, or at least prevented large-scale attacks, and several local rulers offered protection to Jewish communities. As a result, while fear certainly existed, Italy largely avoided the large-scale massacres that scarred other parts of Europe. Well, amid the confusion, Italian intellectuals sought explanations from the plague of their own. Without germ theory, theories ranged from theological to the astrological. Scholars at the University of Paris, whose report circulated in Italy, blamed a rare conjunction of planets that supposedly corrupted the air. Italian physicians and scholars steeped in Aristotelian and Galenic medicine spoke of miasma, poisonous, bad air rising from decaying matter or planetary alignment. Some thought the air had been polluted by earthquakes or noxious gases from the earth, and there was indeed a major earthquake in Italy in January of 1348. Some people took that as a harbinger of the plague. Many clergy framed the event in sermons as a punishment for sin, calling on people to repent. And yet, critical thinking did flicker to life in this dark time. A few observers noted patterns that hinted at natural causes. In Milan and Venice, the effectiveness of isolation suggested that the disease passed from person to person. An idea emerged that avoiding the sick could save one's life. An intuitive grasp of contagion. Doctors like Tommaso del Garbo in Florence wrote plague treatises advising measures that sound surprisingly familiar to us today. Avoid close contact. Burn or air out the clothes and bedding of the sick. Breathe clean air and maintain a healthy diet. While they also recommended now useless remedies like certain concoctions and bloodletting. The better advice of cleanliness, isolation, and moderation probably did help quite a few people survive. After all, it's just common sense. Throughout 1348 and 1349, as wave after wave of plague struck various parts of Italy, the psychological impact was profound. For deeply religious individuals, the apparent indiscriminate nature of the plague, killing the pious and impious alike, was spiritually shattering. The usual comforts of religion had failed to protect communities. Survivors sometimes reported a crisis of faith. The famous poet Francesco Petrarch, living through the plague years, wrote anguished letters to his friends. He lamented that so many lights of the world, scholars, poets, and friends, had been snuffed out. In one letter, Petrarch addresses the future generations with a poignant line, quote, "O happy posterity, who will not know these miseries, and will look upon our testimony as a fable." He struggled to convey to future readers how terrible and surreal the experience was, fearing that those who did not see it would scarcely believe it. This sense of living through an apocalyptic event weighed heavily on the minds of survivors, yet Petrarch himself, as did many others, and their writings show not only despair but also a resilience, a resolve to remember, and ultimately rebuild. By the year 1350, the worst of the plague had mostly passed in Italy, though sporadic outbreaks continued into 1351. Italy itself had been grievously wounded. It is estimated that between one-third and one-half of the population perished in those years. Some places suffered even more. Contemporaries claimed that certain towns lost 60 to 70%. It was as if an entire generation had been culled in one swift stroke. And yet, Italy endured. The end of the plague's first wave did not mean everything returned to normal, however, far from that, but it meant that the survivors could slowly begin to pick up the pieces. In the immediate aftermath, the social and economic landscape of Italy was completely transformed. Whole neighborhoods had become vacant. Entire families had died out, leaving their houses empty and their names extinguished. This grim reality had some unforeseen circumstances. In cities, survivors found that housing was suddenly plentiful and cheap. Imagine that. Laborers and artisans, now scarce, could demand much higher wages for their work, and on the other hand, many who had been poor now found plenty of opportunities to acquire property or positions that really would have been unthinkable before, simply because so many competitors were, well, dead. Certainly helps thin out the competition. A new mobility emerged in society. Peasants in the countryside and workers in the cities had leverage to seek better terms from lords and employers, given the acute labor shortage. Some city governments, shocked by rising wages, tried to legislate against wage increases, but unlike in England's famous Ordinance of Labourers, Italian enforcement of such rules was spotty at best. The power dynamic had subtly shifted in favor of the common people, at least for a time, and this was one way Italy survived, by a painful but real economic rebalancing that ultimately improved conditions for some survivors. Culturally, the scars of the Black Death were deep, for they did not incapacitate Italy. If anything, they set the stage for renewal. Survivors had witnessed unimaginable tragedy. Those who lived through it often developed a different outlook on life. Some became more pious, feeling that God's mercy alone had spared them. Churches did see an influx of donations and thanksgiving, and new religious confraternities, that is, lay brotherhoods, formed, dedicated to prayer and charity, likely inspired by this collective trauma. Others, however, took a more earthly turn, seeking to enjoy the life that was suddenly understood to be fragile and fleeting. The Decameron's storytelling young nobles who escaped the plague-ridden city for the countryside reflect this desire to seize whatever pleasure and beauty life can offer, knowing how suddenly it can all end. This was not mere fiction. Throughout Italy, there were reports after the plague of lavish festivals, high living, and even a certain moral looseness. People thought if they were going to die tomorrow, they may as well live it up. Moralists like Matteo Villani, a Florentine chronicler writing after 1348, scolded the survivors for what he saw as decadence and greed, overtaking humility and compassion. He observed that rather than being chastened by God's punishment, many people became more selfish once the danger had passed, eager to grab wealth and enjoy delights, having inherited the property of the dead. His critiques show another aspect of survival, the debate about lessons learned, or perhaps not learned, from the catastrophe. But what about the institutional side? Well, by 1351, many governments and local councils were functioning again, as if they never ceased. One remarkable testament to resilience is that cities like Venice, Florence, and Genoa continue to operate their financial markets and courts of law, even during the plague, albeit at reduced capacity. But after the plague, these institutions spearheaded recovery efforts, arranging care for orphans, distributing what grain reserves remained to prevent famine, and repairing city infrastructure that had fallen into disrepair. In Florence, for instance, the guilds and governing signoria took steps to attract workers to the city and replace the lost population. They offered citizenship to outsiders more readily than before, in order to repopulate and stimulate commerce. In Siena, despite deep mourning and a shattered economy, the civic project of building the cathedral eventually resumed on a smaller scale, perhaps a sign that not all hope was lost. Genoa and Venice, whose ships had carried the scourge, were by 1350 sending ships out again on trade missions. Commerce revived surprisingly quick, a crucial factor in Italy's recovery. The traders and sailors who survived were determined to get back to business, and European demand for goods still existed. Trade routes, though disrupted, were not permanently closed. This quick resurgence of trade meant that food and supplies could be brought to regions that had lost producers, helping stave off secondary disasters like famine. The Church, too, took stock of what had happened. The papacy, still safe and sound in Avignon at the time, dispensed special grace, such as mass forgiveness for sins of those who died of plague and could not receive the last rites in time. This provided some spiritual consolation and helped ease the fear of eternal damnation that gripped many plague victims who died without a priest present. Local parishes, once reconstituted with new clergy to replace those who had died, held memorials for the dead and provided communal rituals that allowed survivors to mourn together. Something that they couldn't do, of course, when the plague was at its height. These acts of collective mourning and remembrance were important in helping Italian communities heal, at least on a psychological level. The demographic recovery was slow, however, and uneven. Some of the great cities would not reach their pre-plague populations again for many decades. Florence, for example, likely took till the 1420s to regain its former size. Rural areas sometimes never recovered from their previous populations, as survivors gravitated towards cities for work and opportunity. After all, the post-plague world had certainly changed. Families were recombined through hurried marriages to rebuild lineages. Widows and widowers often remarried quickly, and many orphans were adopted by relatives, or just the church. women in particular found new roles, with so many of the men gone, widows inherited businesses and properties, and some took on responsibilities in guilds or trades to keep family enterprises going. In effect, those who remained had to wear many hats. Guilds loosened strict entry requirements to boost their numbers, and younger people advanced faster in crafts and leadership positions, since the old masters were few. All these shifts hinted at a society adapting out of necessity to a new reality with far fewer people. Although the 1347 to 51 outbreak faded, the plague itself was not truly gone. It would resurface in intermittent waves throughout the remainder of the century and beyond. However, Italy's hard-won experience meant that when later plagues occurred, we're talking in 1361, 74, and other years, the society was much better prepared. Cities had then established permanent health magistracies, quarantine ports, and plague hospitals, inspired by the makeshift measures of 1348. People remembered what had helped and what had not. This knowledge didn't stop all suffering, but certainly mitigated the worst of it. And in that sense, the survival of Italy's people and institutions during the first onslaught was just the groundwork for more effective responses in the future. And so by 1351, Italy had survived, but it was very different, changed forever. Families, institutions, and traditions had been tested in the extreme. Italy's survival was not due to any single clever strategy or any miracle cure. There was none of that. But rather it was due to a combination of factors, and just good old-fashioned stubborn clinging to life. The decentralized political structure meant that even if one city was devastated, others could persist and later lend support. There was no single point of failure. The literacy and record-keeping of Italian cities meant that lessons like Pistoia's ordinances or Milan's quarantine tactics could be noted and passed on. The human spirit in countless individual Italians refused to surrender. Doctors kept tending to patients, even as they knew they might die. City elders kept meeting to govern. Farmers returned to their fields as soon as they could. Artists and writers processed the trauma through their own creativity. In Florence, only a few decades later, the first stirrings of the Renaissance would begin, an incredible flowering of art and thought on the very heels of near annihilation. And this is perhaps Italy's greatest testament to survival, that from the ashes of the Black Death, its people not only rebuilt, but went on to produce some of the most brilliant cultural achievements of the medieval era. So what did you learn today? You are still awake, aren't you? Now, the story of how Italy survived the Black Death, it's one of both resilience and tragedy. They endured losses on an unthinkable scale, faced the collapse of social norms, the failure of traditional authorities to provide answers, and the constant specter of death in every single home. Doesn't sound like a place where you'd want to be. But in the face of all of it, they improvised their own ways to cope. City by city, there were bold measures, quarantines, travel bans, sanitary laws, all laying the groundwork for public health. Culturally, Italians commemorated the plague, even as they moved forward. Stories, chronicles, art, all the chilling frescoes like the triumph of death that appeared in those years. These acts of remembering we also see as acts of survival. It gives meaning to the suffering, and even a warning to future generations. And so, In 1351, Italy had come through the worst, far from unscathed, but unbowed. The various republics, duchies, and kingdoms that made up Italy each wrote their own chapter of the catastrophe, and from each we gleaned different insights: the value of swift action and clear rules in Pistoia, the importance of strong leadership, however harsh, in Milan, and the role of maritime controls in Venice, the necessity of community support and documentation in Florence and Siena. They all played their part. I suppose, for those who lived at the time, it really did feel like an apocalypse. But those who came out of it did not forget. They mourned the dead and slowly rebuilt their lives. So in the end, Italy's survival was not just a matter of lives saved in the moments, but the endurance of a civilization. The institutions of Italian society, the city's governments, churches, families, battered but not destroyed. From the depths of the crisis, they found new strengths and new solutions. The Black Death forced them to adapt, and they did. Painfully, unevenly, but just effectively enough. Italy's collective memory, preserved in chronicles and community lore, ensured that the lessons of this dark time were not forgotten. By confronting the horror directly and adapting with courage and ingenuity, Italy not only survived the Black Death, but it found its ways to transform suffering into strength, a legacy that would shape its future generations to come. This hard-won resilience is why, after 1348, the Italian cities remained on their feet, and before long, they were thriving once again. It shows humanity at the mercy of nature's fury, but also our capacity to stand together and persevere even against the greatest of odds. Well, we've reached the end of our exploration into Italy during the Black Plague. What did you think of it? Do you have any insights? Perhaps you do. Well, if you do, you better tell me in the comments, and I'll tell you a secret. If you write a comment, it's actually quite good for the engagement, or so I've heard. Well, I'm going to thank all of the people who gave you a seamless viewing experience. That is the top-tier patrons who keep all the videos ad-free. Doug, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfanir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd. If only we had Dr. Neuro Nerd back in the plague times, A real doctor, I'm sure. Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dowry, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, and Gugu Bubonic, which is funny talking about a bubonic plague video. Thank you very much for everyone's help, especially Gugu Bubonic. Perhaps you're on the inside of this topic. Well, that is it from me, everyone, and I hope that you've learned something, or had a good rest, or that you've just enjoyed the topic. You know, I'll be back here, as always, every day on YouTube for all your long-form history needs. But for now, we say good night, and I will see you whenever you feel like returning. You know where I'll be. Lots of love to you all, and good night.